After that moment in the hallway, life didn't pause, it tightened. The kind of financial pressure that most people never see doesn't come as a single crisis, but as a stack of quiet obligations sitting on a kitchen counter in a suburban American condo. Mortgage statements arrive first, then insurance renewals, then grocery receipts that feel heavier every month because prices don't care about arguments in families. A car note reminder sits next to a credit card bill already carrying interest that no one wants to calculate out loud. On paper, it looks like ordinary middle-class life. But underneath it, every line is a reminder of who is actually carrying responsibility and who is only speaking about control. Inside that condo, before the locks were changed, I was the one who handled those papers. Not emotionally, structurally. I knew which account the mortgage pulled from, which date insurance auto-renewed, how credit utilization shifted when someone forgot to log a purchase. While others in the family treated money as something that simply worked itself out, I treated it like a system that needed to be read. That's why the assumption that I was financially weak never matched reality. Weakness is not knowing the system. Silence is not ignorance. And being younger in a family doesn't mean being financially unprepared. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table separating bills into categories most people ignore. Fixed obligations, variable spending, and hidden fees that quietly build over time. I tracked timing gaps between income deposits and auto-pay withdrawals, because that gap is where most financial stress actually lives. That's something my mother-in-law never saw. She only saw the surface. Who speaks the loudest, who looks most confident, who controls a physical space. But money doesn't live in appearances. It lives in timing, structure, and documentation. The billionaire didn't interfere in any of it. He didn't rescue anything. He simply observed how people interpret control. Standing slightly apart from the family tension, dressed in a quiet, perfectly tailored suit that didn't demand attention, he watched the situation like someone reading a financial report rather than a family conflict. When he finally spoke, it was never emotional. It was precise. People confuse access with ownership, he said once, almost casually, as if it was something he had seen corrected too many times to make it dramatic anymore. We went to a small legal office downtown the next day, the kind of place where paperwork matters more than tone. The air smelled like printer ink and old wood. The lawyer didn't ask about feelings. He asked for documents. That's when I understood why I had kept everything so carefully organized. Bank statements, mortgage schedules, insurance confirmations, payment histories. Every page was a layer of protection I didn't even realize I was building at the time. And still, none of them believed it fully. Not yet. They believed the story of the lock changed more than the structure of ownership. They believed the visible act more than the invisible record. That's the mistake most people make with money. They trust what they can see instead of what is recorded. But somewhere in that folder was something they hadn't properly examined yet. A document that didn't just suggest ownership, but defined it in a way that physical access could never override. And when that document finally comes fully into view, the entire version of events they've been repeating to themselves won't survive it. The strange thing about situations like this is how quickly people decide the story before they ever see the evidence. By the time we left the legal office, the narrative around me had already formed in the minds of others. In their version of events, silence meant weakness. Not speaking meant surrender. Not reacting meant losing. And that is where the first illusion always begins. The first belief people make in financial conflicts like this is that silence equals powerlessness. Because in a world where everyone is performing confidence, the person who doesn't perform is assumed to have nothing to show. But silence is often just the space where structure is being protected, not where it is absent. The second belief is even more dangerous. If you don't display wealth, you must not have it. People confuse visibility with value. They assume the person driving attention is the one driving outcomes. But looking rich and owning assets are not the same system. One is social performance. The other is legal reality. The third mistake is perhaps the most important in this entire situation. People think being inside a property means owning it. Standing in a condo, living in a space, even maintaining it emotionally or physically, none of that defines ownership. Ownership is defined by title, by recorded rights, by the structure that survives even when access changes. A lock can be replaced in minutes. A deed does not respond to minutes. It responds to registration. Then there is the confusion between income and assets. Most people think earning money is the same as being financially secure. But income is just flow. Assets are structure. Income can disappear with one contract change or job shift. Assets continue operating because they are legally defined, not emotionally earned. And finally, the most underestimated mistake. People confuse emotion with evidence. They believe the loudest reaction is the strongest argument. They assume frustration equals truth. But in financial systems, emotion has no enforcement power. Only documentation does. I remember standing outside that office, watching the way different people interpreted the same situation. My mother-in-law saw disrespect. Others saw conflict. But none of them were looking at the underlying structure. Who was on the mortgage? Who made the payments? Who held the insurance records? And who could trace every transaction back through a verifiable system? The billionaire, as always, stayed quiet in a way that felt heavier than speaking. He didn't correct anyone directly. He didn't need to. At one point, he simply said, "Most people confuse control with visibility. But real control is invisible until it's tested." That sentence didn't sound dramatic, but it changed how I started seeing everything. Because the truth is, most financial conflict isn't about money itself. It's about interpretation. One side is operating on perception. Who looks in charge? Who sounds right? Who appears to have authority? The other side is operating on structure. What is recorded? What is enforceable? What survives verification? So I started asking myself a question I wish more people asked before assuming they understand a financial situation. Am I looking at behavior? Or am I looking at proof? Am I reacting to appearance? Or am I reading structure? And somewhere inside that question is where everything in this situation begins to shift. Because beneath the arguments, beneath the social assumptions, and beneath the emotional pressure, there is always a system running quietly in the background. A system of ownership, cash flow, and recorded truth that most people never actually examine closely. And in this case, there is one document inside that folder that has not been fully opened yet. One record that does not just support my position, but completely redefines what everyone thought they were arguing about in the first place. What most people never understand about situations like this is that money doesn't behave like emotion, it behaves like structure. And once you start seeing it that way, everything becomes simpler, even when the conflict becomes more intense. The billionaire was the first person to explain it in a way that didn't sound complicated. We were sitting in a quiet legal waiting area, folders spread across a table, when he said something that stayed with me. Assets don't just make you money. They protect you from losing it. That sentence reframed everything. He broke it down in the simplest possible way. An asset is anything that either puts money into your hands or protects money that already belongs to you. A liability is anything that quietly removes money from your control over time. Most people think they understand this, but they only see the surface version of it. They think a house is always an asset, or that income automatically means stability. But without structure, both can collapse under hidden obligations. Cash flow, he explained, is like invisible employees working for or against you 24/7. If your system is structured correctly, those employees bring money in consistently. If it is not, they quietly take it out through payments, fees, interest, and obligations you barely notice. Until the balance changes. That's why paperwork matters more than emotion in situations like mine. The deed isn't just a piece of paper. It is the legal definition of ownership. The title is not symbolic. It is the authority that determines who the system recognizes. Payment records are not just history. They are proof of who carried financial responsibility. Bank statements are not opinions. They are timelines of actual money movement. Even documents like insurance policies, prenups, or recorded agreements are not background details. They are the invisible walls that protect or expose financial position depending on how they are written and stored. In my case, every document had a role. The deed confirmed ownership structure of the condo. The bank statements showed consistent mortgage payments tied to my accounts. The payment records mapped responsibility over time. Even the insurance documentation reinforced who was financially accountable for the property. And yet, none of that mattered in the hallway when the lock was changed, because emotion had temporarily replaced evidence in the minds of the people watching. That's the real danger most people never notice. When emotion is louder than documentation, Perception tries to override structure. That's why I kept everything organized. Not because I expected conflict every day, but because financial systems only protect what is clearly recorded. Paperwork is not bureaucracy, it is a shield. It is what turns invisible ownership into enforceable reality. At one point, I pulled out a single folder that had been sitting untouched since the beginning of this situation. It contained the original deed, updated title confirmations, and a full payment history that no one had fully reviewed in sequence yet. It was not dramatic in appearance, just a standard legal file. But inside it was something that changed the entire weight of the argument. The billionaire didn't touch it. He just looked at it for a moment and said nothing. That silence was enough to signal that the structure was about to become undeniable. Because once all the records are aligned in one place, once deed, payments, and title all tell the same story, there is nothing left for emotion to compete with. And that is the moment when the final document inside that folder begins to matter more than anything anyone has said so far. Because it is the one piece that will make the system respond, not the people. The moment everything started to change was not loud at all. It happened in a small legal office where the air smelled like paper, ink, and quiet tension. The folder was placed on the table, not opened dramatically, but opened with intention, like someone finally deciding that speculation no longer mattered. Inside that folder, the deed came into full view first. It was simple, almost unimpressive to anyone who didn't understand what they were looking at. But for those who did, it was absolute. The name on the property title confirmed ownership structure in a way no argument could overwrite. No emotion could replace it. No family dispute could cancel it. Next to it, a bank statement lay flat, and one line was circled in red. It wasn't just a number. It was a pattern of financial responsibility, showing consistent mortgage payments tied to verified accounts. The red mark wasn't emotional emphasis. It was identification. A signal pointing to truth hidden inside routine transactions most people never read carefully. Then came the phone. A short video file, paused on the screen, showing a moment that had never been part of the verbal story everyone had been repeating. It didn't need dramatic context. It only needed to exist. Timestamped behavior. Recorded interaction. A sequence of actions that aligned with the financial documents rather than the accusations being made. On the lawyer's desk, another folder sat slightly open. Custody-related documentation tied to financial responsibility structures within the household system. It wasn't central to the condo itself, but it showed how deeply financial accountability was embedded across different parts of life. Money was not isolated. It was connected across legal obligations. Beside it, a sealed envelope contained a prenup agreement, untouched but present. Not emotional, not reactive, just structural. The kind of document that only matters when systems are tested. In her bag, half visible, a company badge from a financial institution rested quietly. It wasn't displayed for attention. It was simply there, like another layer of access and understanding. And in her hand, newly obtained keys were held loosely, not as a symbol of victory, but as confirmation of alignment between legal record and physical access. She did not speak much. She didn't need to. Her calm wasn't confusion. It was preparation meeting confirmation. Every document on that table had already been reviewed by her long before this moment. She was not discovering her position. She was revealing it. The billionaire, sitting slightly back from the table in an understated suit, noticed something others didn't. He saw sequence. He saw structure. He saw that this wasn't improvisation, it was execution. Quiet preparation over time turned into undeniable alignment under pressure. But the people on the other side of the table still didn't understand it. To them, she still looked like the least powerful person in the room. They interpreted silence as uncertainty. They interpreted calmness as lack of control. They believed power had to be loud to exist. That is where they were wrong. Because the most important lesson in money is not who speaks the loudest. It is who can produce structure when everything is challenged. The billionaire finally said it in a low voice, almost like a reminder rather than a lesson. People think money is defended with arguments, but it's actually defended with systems. No one responded, because the documents were already beginning to speak louder than anyone in the room. Still, even with all of this visible, something was not yet resolved. The presence of evidence does not automatically end pressure. It often increases it first. Because once people realize a structure exists that contradicts their narrative, they don't always accept it immediately. And that is exactly what began to happen next. Pressure from family, pressure from perception, and pressure from legal interpretation all starting to rise at the same time, pushing the situation toward a final test that none of them had fully prepared for yet. The pressure did not arrive as one single confrontation. It arrived as a coordinated shift in how everyone in the room chose to interpret the same facts. At first, it was the family. My mother-in-law spoke in a calm but cutting tone, not addressing documents, but attacking identity. Words like entitled, ungrateful, and not fit for responsibility were repeated until they started sounding like financial accusations instead of emotional opinions. My husband stayed caught in the middle, trying to neutralize tension by avoiding commitment to either side, as if silence could balance legal reality. Then came the sisters-in-law, who turned perception into narrative. In their version, I was no longer someone holding verified documents. I became unstable, controlling, and worst of all in their framing, someone trying to take what doesn't belong to her. None of this was supported by the deed, the bank statements, or the recorded payment history. But narratives don't require evidence to spread socially. They only require repetition. Even the legal tone around the situation began to shift under pressure. The lawyer, previously neutral, now spoke more carefully about interpretations of ownership and context of occupancy, as if language could soften what the documents already confirmed. The goal was no longer to deny paperwork, but to dilute its clarity. This is where something very important about money becomes visible. Most people don't lose financial stability because of numbers. They lose it because of pressure to be socially accepted. They pay to avoid judgment. They accept debt to avoid embarrassment. They hold on to homes they can no longer afford because selling would feel like failure in front of others. They confuse financial survival with social approval. That is the invisible cost of perception. In my situation, the pressure was not just legal. It was emotional manipulation wrapped in social expectation. The suggestion was always the same. If I pushed the issue, I would look selfish. If I defended my position, I would be difficult. If I relied on documents instead of relationships, I would be cold. But underneath all of it, the financial reality did not change. The deed still confirmed ownership. Structure. The bank records still showed payment responsibility. The legal files still aligned with my financial history. Nothing in the system responded to emotional labeling. The billionaire observed all of this without stepping into the conflict. He didn't argue with anyone. He didn't defend me. Instead, he watched how quickly people tried to replace structure with perception when they felt uncomfortable. At one point, he said quietly, almost to himself, "Most people don't fight for money. They fight for approval and call it financial decision-making." That sentence revealed something deeper than the argument in the room. Because the real conflict was never just about the condo. It was about who gets to define reality when money, family, and perception collide. And as the pressure increased from every direction, family expectations, social judgment, and legal framing, it became clear that having proof is not always enough to end conflict immediately. Sometimes, it only changes the form of it, which raises a deeper question that no one in the room had fully answered yet. Why do people who truly understand money often choose strategies that look completely opposite to what the majority would do under the same pressure? The shift in the room did not come from emotion. It came from the moment the folder was finally opened in full, without hesitation, without interruption, and without interpretation. The deed was placed first, centered on the table like a final reference point no one could move away from. Every eye in the room was forced to follow it, because everything else now depended on what it confirmed. The lawyer, under pressure to clarify rather than interpret, read the document line by line. The name on the title was not ambiguous. It was not shared in the way people had assumed. It clearly established legal ownership tied to the recorded structure filed with the county registry. There was no emotional language in it, only authority, registration, and enforceable rights. Then came the mortgage and payment records. Bank statements were aligned chronologically, showing consistent monthly payments tied to verified accounts. The narrative that had been repeated, of neglect, of lack of responsibility, of not contributing, collapsed against the visible transaction history. Each payment was time-stamped, traceable, and legally attributable. The structure of responsibility was already documented long before the conflict ever began. The lawyer turned another page. Insurance records confirmed the same pattern. The financial obligation for the property was not passive. It was actively maintained through documented transfers, approvals, and automatic deductions tied to authorized accounts. Then the most critical section, authorization and signature records. The disputed claims about lack of right or improper control were directly contradicted by the signed authorization chain attached to the original filing. Every legal action required for ownership maintenance had a corresponding verified signature or recorded approval. There was no gap in the system. There was only a gap in how people had been interpreting it. At that point, the room changed. Not emotionally, but structurally. The arguments stopped because there was nothing left to argue against that would survive documentation review. Even those who had been most vocal earlier no longer had language that could compete with the records in front of them. The billionaire finally stepped forward, not to take control of the situation, but to clarify what the documents had already made obvious. He looked at the table once and said quietly, "Money doesn't respond to stories. It only responds to structure that can be verified." No one replied, because now the truth was not being debated. It was being confirmed. The central question of the entire conflict, who actually owns the condo, who carried the payments, who had legal authority, and who was relying on assumption, had already been answered by the documents themselves. The deed defined ownership. The payment history defined responsibility. The authorization records defined control. And together, they removed every version of the story that was not supported by evidence. The people who had relied on perception were now facing something they could not easily reinterpret. Because once financial structure is fully exposed, narrative loses its ability to override it. But even with that clarity, consequences were still ahead. Because financial systems do not end at truth being revealed. They move to enforcement, correction, and legal alignment with the verified record. And what happens next is not about who feels right or wrong, but about what the system must now do in response to the evidence that can no longer be ignored. The aftermath did not unfold like drama. It unfolded like procedure. The first confirmation came from the lawyer's office. After a final structured review of the deed, payment history, and authorization chain, the legal position was formally aligned with the documented ownership record. There was no emotional language in the confirmation, only correction. The condo's legal ownership status was reaffirmed based on the registered title, not the recent physical lock change. Next came the property management adjustment. A maintenance notice was issued, not as punishment, but as standard compliance with verified ownership records. The locks that had been changed under assumption were replaced again, this time according to the official title holder listed in the county registry. The technician did not engage in conversation. He simply followed the updated authorization order. Physical access was restored to match legal ownership, not family interpretation. At the bank level, the mortgage account was reviewed and revalidated. Transaction history confirmed continuous payment flow tied to the authorized accounts listed in the documentation. Any previous narrative of non-responsibility or disputed contribution was corrected internally to reflect the verified payment structure. The system did not take sides, it aligned with data. The cash flow record remained consistent, traceable, and legally compliant. In court review, the focus remained strictly on documentation. The judge's consideration was not based on emotional claims, but on title, mortgage records, insurance obligations, and signed authorization documents. Each layer of financial structure reinforced the same conclusion. Ownership and responsibility were already legally defined long before the conflict escalated. Once verified, the case shifted from dispute to enforcement of existing rights. What had changed was not the property itself, but the recognition of who had legal authority over it. Those who had relied on assumption or physical control lost procedural standing, not through confrontation, but through the system simply no longer recognizing their claims as valid against the documented record. There was no escalation required. The structure corrected itself. The billionaire did not celebrate or interfere. He simply observed the outcome with the same calm attention he had shown from the beginning. Then he offered one final reflection, not directed at any individual, but at the situation as a whole. Financial reality doesn't adjust to pressure. It adjusts to documentation. After everything stabilized, the lessons became clear, not as advice, but as patterns that had already proven themselves. Keep financial documents organized and accessible at all times. Always understand whose name is on the title, not just who occupies the property. Track cash flow through real records, not assumptions or verbal agreements. Protect bank accounts and authorization access with clear oversight. Never exchange financial compliance for social approval or emotional pressure. And most importantly, never allow emotion to replace verified evidence when ownership is being questioned. These were not abstract ideas anymore. They were the difference between perceived control and legally recognized control. As the system completed its corrections, one final layer of uncertainty remained, not about the property, but about what this entire experience meant for identity itself. Because once a person's financial position is fully defined by documentation rather than perception, the question is no longer about what they own. It becomes about who they are, when everything they are is finally measured only by what can be proven. In the end, what remained was not the conflict, not the lock change, not even the arguments that once filled the room. What remained was structure, quiet, documented, and impossible to rewrite through emotion. The condo was no longer a question of who spoke the loudest or who appeared most confident. It was defined by what had always defined it: the title, the payment history, the authorization chain, and the legal records that existed long before anyone tried to reinterpret them. Once everything was aligned, the situation stopped being a family dispute and became what it had always been underneath: an issue of financial reality versus perception. The billionaire observed the final state of things with the same calm he had maintained from the beginning. He never positioned himself as a rescuer, because in his understanding, money systems do not require rescue. They require clarity. And clarity only comes from documentation, not argument. When he finally spoke, it was not to conclude the conflict, but to distill the lesson behind it. People think power is loud, he said quietly. But real financial power is silent. It lives in ownership records, cash flow structure, and decisions made long before anyone starts debating them. That idea lingered, because it explained everything that had happened, not just in this case, but in most financial conflicts people never fully understand until it is too late. The younger white woman, who had been underestimated from the beginning, did not transform into someone different. She simply became fully recognized for what she had already been doing quietly: tracking documents, understanding financial structure, and refusing to let emotion replace evidence. Her strength was not in confrontation, but in preparation. Not in argument, but in consistency. She learned, under pressure, that financial survival is not about reacting faster. It is about building a system that does not collapse under interpretation. And that is where identity begins to shift. Because people often assume financial identity is about income, lifestyle, or appearance. But in reality, it is built on something far more stable: what you legally own, what you can prove, how your cash flow behaves, and whether your decisions remain intact when emotions are removed from the equation. The woman's identity in this story was no longer defined by how others perceived her during the conflict. It was defined by the structure she was able to prove when everything was challenged. And the billionaire's role in this was never to intervene emotionally, but to reflect a principle that rarely gets noticed until it is tested. Understanding money is not about talking about it. It is about seeing the system behind it before anyone else does. He represented a kind of financial awareness that does not rely on display. Quiet wealth, quiet understanding, quiet control. Together, their roles revealed the contrast at the center of everything that had happened. Those who rely on perception versus those who rely on structure. Those who argue through emotion versus those who operate through documentation. Those who try to look powerful versus those who are protected by systems that already define their power. And in the end, the lesson was not about winning a dispute. It was about understanding that financial reality does not adjust to opinion. It adjusts to evidence. So the final truth is simple, but permanent. Don't try to look powerful. Build a life where truth, assets, and evidence quietly protect you even when you say nothing at all.